Hello everyone. So welcome again to our lecture 6 and 7. So we continue on our discussion on how development theories have changed over time. So as you can see on your screen now is the familiar slides that I have shown you multiple times to show you that, to remind you that development theories have actually evolved throughout the last 4 to 6 decades. So in the 1950s and 1960s, we have the modernization theory. And then the 1970s, we have the dependency theory, but also growth with equity, which include notions of the basic needs approach or the capability approach. And then in the 1980s, we have participatory and inclusive approach to development, which we discussed in our last lecture. Where does sustainable development fit in this 4 decades, 4 to 5 decades of development theories evolutions? So actually the origin of sustainable development can be dated back to the 1970s. In 1972, there's this actually quite famous theory called the limits to growth. And the limits to growth basically says that our planet is limited. We have limited carrying capacity. And there were other events that occurring during the same time, such as the oil shocks during 1970s, and then we had atmospheric pollution, acid rains, and also the depletion of the ozone layer by CFC, global warming, and other kinds of environmental problems. And if you remember, we have established the Earth Day in 1970s. So the implications of this is that others should not follow the existing way of development. So people were really worried and think that we cannot continue to live the way we do, which is basically the basis of protests for a lot of environmentalism activism during that time. And then the second implication is distributional equity is a concern. So if the world has limited resources, that means it is a zero-sum game now. It's not like, okay, the developed countries have more and then the developing countries can catch up. But it's like, oh, the more the developed countries have, the less the developing countries will get as a result. So distributional equity becomes really a concern internationally. And also, there's a disenchantment with development during that time. If you remember, 1970s is also the peak period of the dependency theories and the world system theories. So people are not interested in the same old rhetoric of modernization and industrialization. And also, we began to see a rise of creative explorations for development alternatives. So there are more and more grassroots development activities and all kinds of diverse conceptions of development at the grassroots level. Okay, so and of course, this overall atmosphere has kind of influenced upwards to the main international development actors such as the United Nations and the World Bank, as demonstrated by their adoptions of the basic needs approach, and also at least the beginning of a demand for the new international economic order. So 1970s is a decade that challenges what has been occurring in the 1950s and 1960s. The mainstreaming of sustainable development, however, really happens only in early 1990s, and primarily through the Brundtland Report by the United Nations. So this is a quotation from the report itself, and I read, humanity has the ability to make development sustainable. The concept of sustainable development does imply limits, not absolute limits, but limitations imposed by the present state of technology and social organization on environmental resources and by the ability of the biosphere to absorb the effects of human activities. But technological and social organization can be both managed and improved to make way for a new era of economic growth. So if you look at this statement, you can see that actually The new version of sustainable development in this Brownlee report is actually free of the discourses of scarcity limits and the failures of development. Even though originally the notion of sustainable development actually indicates all of those, that there is a inherent contradiction between growth and sustainability. But the Brownlee report quite effectively removed these contradictions. So as a result, the new version of sustainability or sustainable development is really appealing to all. So it appeals to the international environmentalists because people are finally talking about international environmental agenda. And then it also works for the social justice advocates because it says that we should not compromise the future generations in fulfilling their needs. So it is talking about equity there. So it also fits the social justice advocates agenda. And most importantly, it doesn't contradict the agenda of pro-growth governments and business leaders, because now it has effectively removed the inherent contradictions between development and environment. So it's now not talking about having a limit to growth, but just talking about how these limits can actually be overcome by more technological innovation. So this is welcomed by business people. So it became a main agenda during the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, and the written constitutions of Agenda 21 was quickly endorsed. So I want to introduce you to a little bit about the context during that time, which you have already known quite a bit by now. But during that time, it was really the beginning of the globalization and internalizations of environmental issues, because people start to feel that, it is not just local pollutions anymore. It is somehow of an international environmental problem that is occurring, especially with the initial understanding of global warming during that period. Now we don't call it global warming anymore. We call it climate change because it doesn't indicate just warming of temperatures, but also changing climatic events. And also, it was the end of Cold War in the early 1990s. You can say that capitalism has triumphed because the ex-Soviet Union has dissolved and communism hasn't worked, it seems like. So people believe that there is no alternative apart from capitalism. And then also there was some kind of misrepresentations of the rising new industrializing countries, like the Asian tigers, Taiwan, Korea, Singapore. It was believed that these countries actually achieve development using participation in the trade system. Even though, as we discussed before, this country actually heavily protect themselves using trade protectionist mechanism and having a strong state. But nonetheless, people believe that, okay, development can work using them as an example. And then there was also a global debt crisis in the 1980s. So a lot of developing countries are owing money. The creditors and development organization actually impose a neoliberal structuring among these countries, basically asking them to minimize state protections and welfare, so that they can have more money to repay the debt, and also propagate them to maximize free trading and free trade as a way to maximize the economic growth. So it was in this context, the second version, the newer versions of sustainable development was being pushed to the global agenda. And then Agenda 21 actually quite effectively raised the line between sustainable development and sustained economic growth. So it tells a story of environmental degradations, being caused by poverty itself to justify further economic growth. So it says that people worldwide are still living in poor conditions. So we have environmental degradation caused by overfishing, overgrazing, and other kinds of things. So basically, sort of blaming or scapegoating the poor for being responsible to the environmental problems that's occurring, but they did that in order to advocate for more growth, right? And then free trade was believed to be able to alleviate poverty and encourage technological innovations. So because poverty is the problem here, we need to alleviate poverty in order to solve environmental problems. And then free trade can be advanced as a way to tackle this issue. And then technological innovations and transfer, particularly transfer of technologies to the poorer countries, will solve ecological limits. The same underlying theories of green growth or ecological modernization. And most importantly, the idea of sustainable development is no longer talking about developing countries anymore. It can actually apply to both North and South, or developed and developing countries. But this new popular version of sustainable development obscure policies of inequity, because sustainable development, the new version of it, was being implemented along with structural adjustment, which asks countries to stop their welfare policies and stop their subsidies and protections of their own businesses and embrace free trade. It actually exacerbates inequity because the poorer people lose all the safety nets as a result. And also, it didn't really solve the problems of externalization of ecological costs in the international trade system. So when we manufacture things and sell things to another parts of the world, consumers from the other parts of the world do not really pay for all the environmental costs. And also, capital mobility, meaning how corporations can move from countries to countries to manufacture their products, depending who offers the cheapest labor and who offers the loosest environmental regulations, and incurring the least cost on the corporations. They will move to those countries in order to maximize their profits. So capital mobility actually causes race to the bottom by countries. Part of this is to really take away all the regulations to protect your labor and all the regulations to protect your environment in order to attract these foreign investments. So essentially, the new sustainable development actually built on the same premises that it once opposes. So before the end of this part of the lecture, I want to pose a question. Do you think there is an inherent contradiction within the term sustainable development? In other words, is sustainable development an oxymoron? Why and why not? Do you have an example in mind that you can provide us with? Okay, thank you very much for listening.